For 7 years, Evelyn Ashcroft's $90 million jet sat like a curse made of metal. 200 engineers replaced engines, rewrote software, and burned through tens of millions of dollars. Yet every single attempt died at exactly the same moment, 7 seconds after ignition. When Caleb Rowan, a single father in a faded gray work uniform, pointed at one reversed bolt, the entire hangar laughed at him. 7 minutes later, the engine roared to life. But before Caleb could walk away, the CEO found his name buried inside a file that had been sealed for 7 years. If you want to watch Caleb turn 7 minutes into a corporate reckoning nobody saw coming, hit subscribe now and stay with the story until the very end. The hangar belonging to Ashcroft Dominion sat at the edge of a private airfield, its steel walls gleaming under floodlights long before sunrise, because today was not an ordinary morning. Evelyn Ashcroft needed the Aurelius X9 in the air within hours to close a contract worth billions, a deal that had taken 18 months to negotiate and could not survive another delay. The jet itself was a monument to obsession, custom-built, endlessly modified, and for 7 years, functionally useless, because every attempt at a full-engine startup ended the same way, a sudden shutdown at precisely the 7th second. Inside the hangar, 36 engineers moved with the particular panic of people who knew their jobs were being watched by a board of directors on a live video feed. Preston Crowe stood at the center of it all, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that cost more than most of his junior staff earned in a month, insisting into his headset that the issue was nothing more than a minor software conflict, the same explanation he had offered a dozen times across 7 years. Caleb Rowan arrived that morning, the way he arrived every morning, quietly pushing a cart of tools through a side entrance reserved for contracted maintenance staff, his uniform faded from years of washing, his hands already stained with grease from an earlier job. Nobody in that hangar knew his history. To them, he was simply the man who emptied trash bins near the tarmac and occasionally tightened a loose panel, invisible in the way that skilled labor often becomes invisible to people who measure worth by job titles. While the engineers argued over telemetry readings, Caleb paused near the rear of the cabin, his head tilting slightly because he had heard something the others hadn't, a relay clicking twice in rapid succession behind the interior paneling. He checked his watch out of habit and realized the timing lined up exactly with the moment the generator transferred power to the cabin systems. Caleb asked calmly and without accusation whether the satellite communication array had been active during the previous test runs. Crowe didn't answer him directly. Instead, he ordered security to move the maintenance worker out of the restricted technical zone, annoyed that a contractor was even standing close enough to ask questions. That was when Evelyn walked in, sharp-heeled and visibly furious that her schedule was collapsing in real time, and when she learned a low-level technician was interrupting the very engineers she was paying millions to fix her jet. She told Caleb, coldly, not to get in the way of people who had spent years solving this exact problem. As 2 guards escorted him toward the exit, Caleb glanced once more at a diagnostic screen glowing near the cockpit door, and his stomach tightened because the modification code displayed on that screen matched a proposal he had personally refused to approve 7 years earlier. Before the guards pulled him fully out of the hangar, Caleb said one sentence loud enough for several engineers to hear. They didn't have an engine problem. They were looking in the wrong place entirely. Outside the hangar, a line of black sedans idled near the tarmac, waiting for a departure that seemed further away with every passing minute. Evelyn's assistant kept refreshing a phone screen filled with messages from the partner company, each one more impatient than the last, reminding her that the deal on the table involved partners who did not forgive delays. Inside, engineers pulled up years of archived telemetry, cross-referencing engine temperatures, fuel pressure curves, and software revision histories that had already been rewritten more times than anyone could count. Crow walked the floor like a man rehearsing a speech he had given many times before, reassuring nervous junior staff that the fix was close, that it had always been close, even though 7 years of closeness had produced nothing but silence on the runway. Caleb stood near the doorway a moment longer than the guards expected, his eyes tracing the wiring bundle that ran along the ceiling toward the cabin, the same path he remembered sketching on a whiteboard years earlier when the aircraft was still being assembled. Nobody noticed him memorizing the layout because nobody had ever thought to look at him twice. Years earlier, in a different version of his life, Caleb had walked these same corridors wearing a badge that granted him access to every technical compartment on the aircraft, back when his signature carried weight in design reviews and his opinions were solicited rather than dismissed. He remembered the exact week the cabin power converter had been installed, remembered arguing that the mounting location placed it too close to sensitive control wiring, and remembered being told, politely at first and then not so politely, that the schedule mattered more than a theoretical concern nobody else seemed worried about. That memory sat quietly behind his eyes as the guards walked him toward the exit, not as bitterness but as a kind of patience, the particular patience of a man who already suspected exactly where this story was going to end up. Crow seized the opportunity to publicly dismantle Caleb's credibility in front of the entire technical team, listing off the universities, manufacturers, and laboratories that had contributed to 7 years of repairs, then asking, with theatrical disbelief, what qualifications a maintenance contractor could possibly have to contradict 200 engineers. Caleb didn't recite a resume. He simply asked to see the flight data logged during the 7 seconds before each shutdown. Crow refused, reminding him that contractors did not have clearance for that level of system access. A cluster of younger engineers laughed when Caleb suggested the failure might be hiding behind a cabin panel, instead of buried inside an engine worth tens of millions of dollars, mocking his worn toolbox and his boots stained with hydraulic fluid. Evelyn, out of options rather than curiosity, gave him exactly 60 seconds to explain himself. Caleb described the failure sequence with unsettling precision, the engine igniting normally, the generator stabilizing, the cabin power converter accepting load, a relay chattering twice, and then the flight control computer receiving 2 contradictory signals and shutting the engine down as a safety measure. Mara Quinn, the newly appointed head of quality assurance, pulled the internal logs and confirmed that every detail Caleb described matched timestamps that had never been included in the summary reports sent to the CEO. Crow insisted Caleb was simply guessing based on sound, and warned that any unauthorized interference with the aircraft could void the company's entire insurance policy. Caleb replied that he didn't need to touch anything yet. He only needed the satellite communication converter switched off before the next test. Crow agreed reluctantly, certain the attempt would humiliate the contractor once and for all. When the satellite system was disabled and the engine ignited again, it did not shut down at the 7th second, but a new warning appeared at the 12th second instead. Nobody in that hangar was laughing anymore. Caleb pointed to a silver-paneled section near the rear of the cabin and said quietly that the failure was hiding somewhere behind it. For a moment, nobody moved. The engineers who had spent years chasing this exact malfunction stared at the panel Caleb had indicated as though it might answer them directly. One senior technician muttered that the section had been inspected years earlier and cleared as structurally fine, and Crow latched onto that comment immediately, using it to argue that Caleb's small victory with the satellite converter proved nothing beyond a coincidence involving timing. Evelyn wasn't interested in Crow's explanations anymore. She had watched 200 professionals fail to produce, in 7 years, what a man in a stained uniform had narrowed down in under 10 minutes. And even though she hadn't decided to trust him yet, she recognized the particular calm of someone who wasn't guessing. Mara quietly requested archived maintenance photographs of that section from 3 years earlier, comparing them frame by frame against the current configuration, searching for any inconsistency that might explain how such an obvious detail had escaped 200 engineers for so long. What she found unsettled her more than she expected. In one photograph, a technician's gloved hand rested near the exact bracket Caleb had pointed toward, dated years before the most recent inspection reports claimed the area had ever been touched. The timestamp alone suggested that someone had accessed the compartment without ever logging the visit, which meant either the maintenance records were incomplete by accident, or someone had deliberately kept that particular repair off the books. Mara said nothing yet, choosing instead to gather more evidence before raising a question that could implicate people far more senior than a photograph alone could prove guilty. Evelyn demanded to know how a contracted technician had narrowed down a problem in minutes, when 7 years of official reports had insisted the fault belonged to the engine itself. Crow blamed coincidence and pushed the conversation toward liability concerns, trying to redirect attention away from the fact that the warning light had not disappeared entirely. Caleb explained that disabling the satellite system only removed the largest single power load, but the underlying interference pathway still existed, which meant the real source of the problem lived somewhere inside the cabin's electrical wiring rather than in the communications hardware itself. Evelyn asked, more pointedly this time, whether Caleb had ever worked on the Aurelius X9 before. He avoided a direct answer, saying only that he had seen a design nearly identical to it once. While the conversation continued, Mara quietly searched the personnel archives for his name, and discovered that his employment file had almost been erased entirely, except for a single surviving document confirming that Caleb Rowan had once served as the lead systems integration engineer on this very aircraft's original build. Crow used that discovery against him instead of questioning it, telling the room that Caleb had been terminated for incompetence and insubordination, twisting his history into evidence that he could not be trusted. Caleb remained composed, revealing that 7 years earlier he had warned that the cabin power converter was mounted dangerously close to the engine's control data lines, and had requested electromagnetic interference testing before the aircraft's final handover. Crow, at the time, had forced the team to skip that testing to protect the delivery deadline. When Caleb refused to sign off on the modification, his digital signature was quietly removed from the certification file, and he was dismissed almost immediately, just weeks before his wife's illness required the kind of medical care his salary could no longer provide. Evelyn didn't fully trust him yet, but she realized, with a growing unease, that Crow had never once mentioned that an engineer on this very project had objected to the modification years earlier. Caleb offered a simple proposal, 7 minutes of supervised access to the technical compartment, and if he was wrong, he would walk away without asking for a single dollar. Evelyn looked at Crow, then handed Caleb temporary clearance despite furious objections from nearly everyone on the technical staff. Crow pulled Evelyn aside before the clearance was finalized, warning her privately that granting an outsider access to a proprietary aircraft system could expose the company to liability far greater than a missed business meeting. Evelyn reminded him, quietly but firmly, that 7 years of his own liability had already cost the company more than any contractor could threaten. She wasn't defending Caleb out of sympathy. She was making a calculated decision, the kind she had built her career on, weighing a small, controlled risk against the certainty of continued failure. Mara used the delay to pull physical maintenance records from a storage archive 2 floors below the hangar, confirming that the compartment behind the rear cabin panel had not been formally reopened in nearly 4 years. despite being listed as inspected annually in the official maintenance logs. That single inconsistency, buried in paperwork nobody had bothered to cross-reference, would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. While Mara worked, Caleb stood quietly near the tool cart, running through the sequence of steps in his mind the way he used to before every certification test years earlier, refusing to let the noise of the room or the weight of the countdown rush his process. A young apprentice technician offered him a bottle of water, the first small kindness anyone in that hangar had extended to him all morning, and Caleb thanked him by name, having noticed the young man's badge earlier, despite the chaos surrounding them both. It was a small moment easily missed by everyone else in the room, but it reminded Caleb that not everyone inside that company had forgotten what respect was supposed to look like. A countdown appeared on the large monitor mounted above the hangar floor, and Crow made certain everyone understood this was meant to be a public demonstration of Caleb's failure. Caleb didn't rush. He requested the main power be cut, confirmed the area was electrically safe, and put on anti-static equipment exactly according to protocol, a level of discipline that quietly contradicted everything Crow had said about him. During the first minute, he removed the panel behind the satellite converter, while one engineer muttered that dozens of teams had already opened that same section years ago. Caleb noticed something they had missed. A factory seal on a mounting bracket that didn't match the maintenance history on file, proof that a component had been altered without ever being properly documented. By the third minute, he traced the grounding wire to a connection point hidden behind a decorative trim panel, and there it was, a shoulder bolt installed backward, its contact surface resting against an insulated coating instead of bare conductive metal. Caleb explained, without drama, that the bolt itself wasn't defective. It had simply been installed in the wrong orientation, turning the entire assembly into an unintended source of electromagnetic interference whenever it carried a heavy electrical load. Crow scoffed, insisting something so small couldn't possibly bring down an engine, but Caleb didn't argue with him. He pulled a correctly manufactured bolt from his maintenance kit, reseated the grounding wire at the exact point specified in the original design blueprint, and tightened it to precise torque specifications. With less than a minute remaining on the countdown, he closed the access panel and requested power be restored. The engine ignited. The 7th second passed. No warning appeared. The 12th second passed, and the entire system remained stable. The sound of the engine filled the hangar, steady and unbroken, while the same engineers who had mocked him minutes earlier stood frozen in silence. Evelyn glanced at the clock. 6 minutes and 58 seconds. While the room remained stunned, Mara managed to unlock a sealed internal file and saw Caleb's signature on a warning document that had been marked 7 years earlier as never distributed. For a long moment, the only sound in the hangar was the steady hum of the idling engine, low and even, nothing like the frantic sputtering everyone had grown accustomed to over the years. Junior engineers who had laughed at Caleb's toolbox less than an hour earlier now stood staring at the same toolbox as though it contained something they didn't understand. One of them quietly picked up the discarded, backward bolt from the workbench and turned it over in his palm, studying the manufacturing stamp as if searching for some hidden explanation that would make the failure less embarrassing. Evelyn didn't celebrate. She watched the readouts stabilize past the 12th second, then the 20th, then the 30th, waiting for the deception her instincts told her must be coming, because nothing this simple should have taken 7 years and tens of millions of dollars to uncover. When the engine held steady past the 1-minute mark without a single fluctuation, she finally exhaled, and for the first time that morning, she looked at Caleb not as an intruder, but as a variable she hadn't accounted for. Instead of accepting defeat, Crow immediately claimed that Caleb had performed an unauthorized modification to the aircraft, insisting the engine's stability was likely temporary and demanding that security detain him for questioning. He attempted to claim credit for himself, telling the room that his own team had already narrowed the problem down and that Caleb had simply stumbled into the final step by chance. Several managers quickly echoed him, terrified of admitting that millions of dollars had been wasted under their supervision. And within minutes, the man who had just saved the aircraft was being treated as a suspect in an act of sabotage. Evelyn asked whether Caleb's repair matched approved engineering standards. Mara confirmed that both the bolt and the grounding point existed exactly as specified in the original design documentation, meaning Caleb had restored the aircraft to its approved configuration, rather than altering anything without authorization. Crow shifted his attack toward Caleb's personal life, suggesting he was acting out of resentment toward the company that had fired him years earlier and accusing him of exploiting his position as a single father for sympathy. Caleb didn't ask Evelyn to trust him. He asked her to review the complete modification history and the names of everyone who had authorized skipping the original safety testing. Evelyn realized, with growing discomfort, that Crow had known far more about Caleb's dismissal than he had ever admitted, despite once claiming he had never even heard the man's name before that morning. She ordered every technical file locked, prohibiting any deletion or alteration of records effective immediately, and Crow understood in that moment that the real problem was no longer the aircraft but everything that had been buried for 7 years. Mara discovered that someone was already attempting remote access to delete the folder containing Caleb's original warning. She saw the deletion request appear on her screen almost by accident, a routine system notification she nearly dismissed before recognizing the file name referenced inside it. Her hands moved fast, copying the folder to an isolated backup drive she kept for exactly this kind of situation, a habit she had developed after watching smaller inconsistencies disappear from company records during her first year on the job. The screen blinked once. The original file vanished from the primary server, and had she been 30 seconds slower, the only surviving proof of Caleb's 7-year-old warning would have existed nowhere except inside his own memory. Mara didn't say anything to Crow. She simply walked toward Evelyn's office, laptop in hand, aware that whatever she had just captured was about to change the entire direction of the investigation. Along the way, she passed a group of engineers still huddled around the workbench, examining the reversed bolt as though it were an artifact from some other era, and she felt the strange, uncomfortable weight of knowing something none of them did yet. She thought about the dozens of maintenance summaries she had signed off on since joining the company, wondering how many of them had quietly omitted details the way this one had, and whether her own signature had unknowingly helped protect a story that was never true to begin with. By the time she reached Evelyn's office door, her hands were steady again, but her understanding of the company she worked for had shifted permanently. Mara managed to back up the data seconds before the deletion request completed, and the access log revealed the command had originated from an administrative account tied directly to Crow's office. Evelyn called an emergency meeting inside the hangar itself, patching in board chairman Gideon Blackwell and several directors through video conference. Crow shifted tactics again, admitting he had delayed certain tests but framing it as a necessary business decision to protect the company's timeline, insisting Caleb's original warning had been theoretical rather than backed by real evidence. Mara pulled up Caleb's original report, which had predicted, with remarkable precision, that an electromagnetic disturbance would occur at the exact moment the generator transferred load, causing the engine control system to shut itself down. The same report had explicitly recommended inspecting the grounding point behind the cabin power converter, a test that would have cost a fraction of what the company had wasted across 7 years of failed repairs. The board began turning its questions toward Crowe, though Blackwell still wanted the entire incident kept quiet to avoid damaging the company's stock price and public reputation. He proposed paying Caleb a substantial sum in exchange for a confidentiality agreement, requiring him to drop any claims and allow the company to publicly credit its internal team for solving the problem. Caleb refused. He said the real issue wasn't money or recognition, but the fact that 200 engineers had been steered by incomplete information, many of them failing not because they lacked skill, but because they were never allowed to see the truth. He set 3 conditions: an independent inspection of the entire aircraft, restored professional standing for every engineer who had been unfairly blamed over the years, and a public internal record explaining the true technical cause of the failure. Evelyn began to understand that Caleb was protecting the very people who had mocked him hours earlier. Crowe warned that if the independent inspection proceeded, the aircraft could be permanently grounded, and the largest deal in Ashcroft Dominion's history could collapse entirely. Blackwell asked Caleb directly, almost dismissively, why any of this mattered to him personally, since he no longer worked for the company and had nothing left to gain from defending engineers he barely knew. Caleb answered without hesitation, saying that he remembered exactly what it felt like to raise a concern and watch it disappear into a system designed to protect the people at the top rather than the truth at the bottom. He said he had spent 7 years wondering whether staying silent might have been easier, and had decided, watching his daughter grow up without a mother, that easier wasn't the same as right. The room went quiet at that. Even Blackwell, who had spent decades hardened against sentiment in boardrooms, seemed to reconsider the calculation in front of him. Evelyn watched Caleb carefully, recognizing something in his answer that no consultant or executive coach had ever managed to teach the people currently seated around her boardroom table. She thought, briefly, of her own father, who had built the earliest version of this company from a single cargo plane and a handful of loyal mechanics, and who had always insisted that a business built on comfortable lies eventually collapses under its own weight. Evelyn had inherited the company at a scale her father never imagined, along with layers of management he never would have tolerated, and standing in that hangar, she felt for the first time in years the particular discomfort of realizing how far the company had drifted from the principles it claimed to represent. She excused herself briefly from the meeting, not to escape the conversation, but to collect herself, before making a decision she knew would define the rest of her tenure as chief executive. Crowe used his connections within the board to pressure Evelyn directly, arguing that no chief executive could responsibly place the company's future in the hands of a disgruntled contractor. Rumors began reaching outside sources, framing Caleb as a former employee who had illegally tampered with a billionaire's private jet, rather than the man who had solved a 7-year failure. The company that employed Caleb as a contractor received a request to terminate his assignment immediately, threatening to strip him of his only remaining source of income within hours. Sadie called her father after seeing the news online. The conversation was brief, without melodrama, and she reminded him that he had once taught her the truth doesn't become false just because someone powerful dislikes hearing it. Caleb returned to the hangar, not to beg for his job, but to finish writing his technical report before he intended to leave for good. Mara discovered that Crowe had quietly ordered the maintenance crew to replace the entire grounding wire assembly Caleb had just repaired, a move that would erase the physical evidence proving the bolt had ever been installed backward. Evelyn personally intervened to stop the removal, the first time she had openly confronted Crowe in front of the entire staff. Crowe played what he believed was his final card, pointing out that the aircraft had never actually been flight tested meaning a single successful ground startup proved nothing about whether the underlying issue had truly been resolved. The board demanded an independent verification flight, warning that if the aircraft failed, Caleb would bear full responsibility for interfering with the system, but if it succeeded, Crow's entire file would be forwarded to federal investigators. Caleb agreed, but refused to allow anyone aboard until every system had been transparently verified beforehand. During the final pre-flight check, Caleb discovered that someone had secretly lowered the recorded cabin power load specification, a change that could produce a falsely successful test result. He found it almost by instinct comparing the load figures displayed on the pre-flight checklist against the numbers he remembered from the original design specification years earlier. The discrepancy was small, easy to miss unless someone already knew exactly what number to expect, which was precisely why whoever made the change had been confident it would slip past an outside inspection team unfamiliar with the aircraft's history. Caleb didn't announce his discovery immediately. He photographed the checklist, cross-referenced it against 3 separate archived documents, and waited until Mara was present before saying anything aloud, unwilling to give anyone the chance to quietly correct the number before it could be used as evidence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the satisfaction someone might expect from catching a saboteur in the act. He simply stated the discrepancy, the source file it came from, and the fact that someone inside the company still preferred a convincing lie over an inconvenient truth. Evelyn read the comparison herself, twice, before setting the tablet down on the workbench with a quiet, controlled anger that unsettled the executive standing nearest to her. An anger far colder and more dangerous than the loud frustration she had shown earlier that morning. She asked the inspection team directly whether a test conducted under the falsified load specification would have satisfied their certification requirements, and when they confirmed it likely would have, she understood exactly how close the company had come to declaring victory over a problem that hadn't actually been solved. It wasn't just Crow's reputation at stake anymore. It was the credibility of every safety certification the company had ever issued, and Evelyn intended to make certain nothing left this hangar without being verified the way it should have been from the very beginning. Caleb announced he would not authorize the flight to proceed with a test configuration that had clearly been manipulated. Crow immediately accused him of stalling because he feared his own repair might fail under real conditions. Caleb pointed out the exact discrepancy between the current configuration and the full load specification, listed in the aircraft's official operating manual, explaining that testing at a reduced load could allow the failure to remain hidden even if the grounding connection wasn't fully corrected. Mara traced the unauthorized change to an account belonging to a manager closely aligned with Crow, and Evelyn ordered the cabin load restored to its correct specification, inviting the independent inspection team to observe the process directly. Caleb didn't pilot or operate the aircraft himself. He stood in the ground control center, monitoring voltage readings, temperature levels, and signal integrity as the test began. The engine ignited. The satellite communication system operated at full capacity. The generator transferred load exactly as it always had. No interference spike appeared anywhere on the monitors. The Aurelius X-9 taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky for the first time in years without the artificial restrictions that had limited its operation. The tension in the hangar didn't disappear entirely because as the aircraft reached its testing altitude, an old warning flickered briefly across one display. Crow declared instantly that Caleb had been wrong after all, but Caleb recognized immediately that the alert wasn't a new engine fault. It was residual data still stored in a backup memory bank that had never been cleared after an earlier failed test years before. The independent inspection team confirmed the current system remained completely stable, completing a full load cycle, restarting cabin systems multiple times, and transferring power repeatedly without a single failure. When the Aurelius X-9 landed, the entire hangar fell silent, waiting for a final verdict. The lead inspector announced that the root cause had been correctly identified and repaired according to the original approved engineering design. Evelyn stepped off the aircraft, walked past a row of waiting executives, and stopped directly in front of Caleb. The applause that erupted around the hangar felt strange to Caleb, distant somehow, as though it belonged to a different version of this story, where he had simply been hired to fix a stubborn machine rather than to expose 7 years of quiet institutional decay. He watched Evelyn's face closely as she crossed the tarmac, searching for the polished, camera-ready gratitude he expected from a chief executive who had just avoided losing the largest deal of her career. Instead, her expression carried something heavier, the particular exhaustion of someone who had just spent an entire day discovering how much of her own company had been operating without her knowledge. Crow stood off to the side, arms crossed, his composure cracking at the edges as engineers who once deferred to him now glanced toward Caleb whenever a technical question arose. Nobody needed to say it aloud. The balance of authority inside that hangar had already shifted long before Evelyn opened her mouth. A photographer hired to document the successful test flight for internal company records kept trying to frame Evelyn and Crow together near the aircraft, unaware that the story unfolding in front of her had nothing to do with the 2 executives she assumed would headline it. Caleb stepped out of frame each time, uninterested in being photographed, more concerned with reviewing the flight data one final time to confirm the numbers matched what he had predicted hours earlier. Mara eventually pulled the photographer aside and quietly redirected her attention, sensing, correctly, that the real image worth capturing that day wasn't a celebratory handshake, but the quiet moment when Evelyn finally stopped walking past the man who had solved what her entire company could not. Everyone assumed Evelyn intended to offer a private thank you or a modest reward. Instead, she called for an immediate board session right there inside the hangar, insisting every engineer present witness what came next. She laid out the facts one by one, how Caleb's original report had been buried, how repair data had been deliberately restricted, how millions of dollars had been wasted, and how numerous engineers had been unfairly blamed for a failure they were never given the tools to understand. Crow tried to justify himself, claiming he had only been protecting the company from a delay that could have destroyed the contract, but Evelyn responded that he hadn't been protecting the company at all. He had been protecting his own position. Mara presented the evidence, showing that Crow had personally authorized the deletion of records, altered the test configuration, and spread false information about Caleb's history and intentions. The board voted to suspend Crow immediately, referring his file to the legal department and to federal aviation regulators. There was no violence, no dramatic confrontation, only the quiet collapse of a man undone by the very documents and signatures he had once used to control everyone around him. The engineers who had mocked Caleb earlier that day stood in visible embarrassment, and one younger engineer stepped forward on behalf of the group to apologize for judging him based on his clothing and his job title. Caleb didn't take pleasure in their humiliation. He told them that expertise doesn't live on a name tag, and that any system will keep failing if it keeps punishing the people brave enough to ask difficult questions. Evelyn publicly confirmed that Caleb Rowan had repaired the aircraft in under 7 minutes after 7 years of failure, and admitted that her own leadership culture had allowed the truth to remain hidden for far too long. In front of the entire staff, she offered Caleb a position that Crow had once insisted he would never be qualified to hold. Security escorted Crow out through a side door rather than the main entrance, a small detail that nonetheless carried enormous weight for the engineers watching him go, many of whom had spent years too afraid to question his decisions out loud. Word of the suspension spread through the company within hours, not through any official statement, but through the kind of quiet, rapid communication that happens whenever people finally feel safe enough to talk about what they had noticed all along. Several engineers approached Mara privately afterward, admitting they had suspected inconsistencies in the maintenance reports years earlier, but had never felt confident enough or protected enough to say anything. Evelyn made a note of every name, promising each of them a real conversation once the dust settled, understanding now that Crow's failure hadn't just been technical. It had been cultural, built on fear, and it would take far more than replacing one executive to fully repair the damage that fear had caused across 7 years. In the days that followed, the story of the reversed bolt spread quietly through every department of Ashcroft Dominion, told and retold until it became something closer to legend than incident report. Employees who had never met Caleb personally began referencing him as an example whenever a supervisor tried to dismiss a concern too quickly, a small but meaningful shift in how people spoke up inside meetings that had once rewarded silence over honesty. Evelyn noticed the change almost immediately, and rather than discourage it, she began citing the incident herself during leadership briefings, determined to make certain the lesson outlived the headlines that had briefly surrounded it. Evelyn offered Caleb the role of Vice President of Systems Reliability across all of Ashcroft Dominion, a position with significant salary and real authority, the kind of offer that could change a man's life in an instant, but Caleb didn't accept immediately. He asked that the role include the authority to halt any project posing a safety risk, even one supported by the chief executive or the board itself. He also requested the creation of an independent reporting system so that junior engineers could raise concerns without fear of losing their jobs, and insisted that every engineer previously blamed by Crow have their records reviewed and receive appropriate compensation. Blackwell objected, arguing the conditions would limit the board's authority, but Evelyn sided firmly with Caleb, telling the room that a $90 million aircraft grounded for 7 years was proof that unchecked power cost far more than any structural reform ever could, and that the price of comfortable silence had already been paid many times over. Caleb accepted the position once every condition was formally written into the agreement. He didn't become an arrogant man chasing wealth or revenge. His new office remained near the maintenance floor rather than on the executive level upstairs. Months later, the Aurelius X-9 completed its first fully stable commercial flight. Evelyn invited both Caleb and Sadie to witness the moment, but Caleb chose to stand with the ground crew beneath the runway instead of inside the executive viewing area. Sadie appeared briefly, watching her father's name restored within the aircraft's official design records, and she wasn't interested in his new title. She was simply proud that he had refused to let anyone else rewrite the truth. Evelyn approached him privately afterward, admitting that she had once mistaken the confidence of powerful men for genuine competence. Caleb told her the aircraft hadn't actually taken 7 years to fix. It had only taken 7 years to find someone with enough power willing to listen to the person who already knew how. Sadie visited the hangar one final time before the story faded from company conversation and became just another part of Ashcroft Dominion's history. She stood beside her father near the same workbench where the reversed bolt had once been discarded, and she asked him, half joking, whether he was finally going to buy a new toolbox now that his salary had changed. Caleb smiled and told her some things were worth keeping exactly as they were, a reminder of where he started and what it had cost him to be believed. Sadie looked around the hangar one last time, at the engineers who now greeted her father by name instead of walking past him, and she realized that the biggest change wasn't the title on his office door or the number on his paycheck, but the simple fact that people finally stopped and listened when he spoke. Evelyn later established a formal review process across every division of the company, modeled directly on the conditions Caleb had insisted upon, ensuring that no warning from a junior employee could ever again be quietly buried to protect someone else's career. Engineers who had once been blamed for failures beyond their control received formal apologies and restored standing within the company records, a small correction against 7 years of silence, but a correction nonetheless. As the Aurelius X-9 climbed into the open sky on its first full commercial flight, back inside the hangar, the single reversed bolt was placed inside a glass case, with one simple line engraved beneath it, a reminder that the smallest mistake can survive for years when pride grows larger than the truth.
Thank you, Bam Bam. I appreciate it, bro. Got from work. Which one do you like? Of what? What do you mean? I have to go get the baby. I didn't pick up the baby attack. It wouldn't let me. Let's go back. Reignite spell? You mean sparks? Alright, my stamina's maxed. Staff spin. Oh, my health. Oh. Oh shit, I've been putting it into the wrong thing. Whoops. Dodging. Slightly increase stamina. Oh, maybe I will keep it.